Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We are glad that you are joining us again this week. We are continuing to go along in our Apologetics series, where each week we are taking on a different argument that you might hear out in the world for those who have concerns, questions about Christian life, what we as Christians believe and teach. So we hope that this series is constructive and we are all being encouraged by these lessons. Of course, as we always say, we hope that we are all able to gather together on Sunday mornings for our usual Bible class. The sooner the better. But until then, we will continue to have our conversations here, and we really appreciate you joining us in those conversations. So this week, we are going to talk about, it's kind of not a fun subject. We're going to talk about hell, and specifically the atheist argument, the argument that a just God, a loving God, cannot simply send people to hell. And so, if that's the God that we worship, then there must be something wrong with that conception. So, can the Christian idea of hell fit into Christian teachings, Christian doctrine? So I guess some of the questions we will seek to ask and answer are, what is hell and what isn't it? I think we'll start there. And also, what are some of the reasons why a just God couldn't go along with hell according to atheist arguments? And we'll try to offer what some Christians think about these issues. And I'll go ahead and say this at the top. There are some Christians, some people who believe in Jesus and would count themselves as Christians, who also ask questions about hell. So sometimes we might even find these questions within the church. So it's important for us as Christians to be prepared for these questions, no matter where they might come from. So with that said, we have a lot to get to tonight. So Jeremy, why don't you start us off with what isn't hell? How do we think about hell?
Well, it's important to remember that much of our modern conception of hell actually comes from culture. You think about cartoons you watch, kind of those classic 1950s, 70s. Yeah, the devil, the demons, horns, the tail, the pitchfork, the red, the red's either red clothes or they're red, and he's down there and there's fire everywhere and it's always underground, and they're torturing people and things like that. And that's the conception we have of hell, which ironically comes more from culture. Dante's Inferno, the first of the Divine Trilogy. Dante, his main character, tours hell, and you got the 9 circles of hell, and each one of them is directly related to some type of sin, and the sinners who are guilty of that sin, when they go there, they suffer eternal torture. Okay, it's almost pulled from Tartarus of Greek mythology, the place of eternal punishment. And
it's Virgil that's leading him through.
Right,
so
yeah.
There's very much a tie to these ancient mythologies and trying to pair Christian thought with the vivid scenes that they had seen.
Right. The tortures that you see, the guy rolling in Tartarus, the guy rolling the boulder uphill, and he can't ever get it to the top. Yeah. The guy who's suspended in the lake, and the things, the trees dripping, but he can't ever eat, he can't ever drink, things like that. Okay. That's not the biblical portrayal of hell. Now, it's important to remember that when the Bible talks about the spiritual world, it is attempting to describe the indescribable. Okay. So it is giving us examples that we can grab onto, but we need to be careful how literally we take these things. Okay. And when you put together the biblical picture of hell, it's described as it's the place prepared for Satan. It's described as the outer darkness. It's fire and brimstone. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth there. Okay. All of those things come together to describe a place that is the most painful, the most horrible, the most disheartening place you can imagine. It's like, okay, it's not an eternal torture chamber. Okay, let's just come out and say that. It is when the demons and when Satan, and Wormwood and Screwtape and all the boys, when they get cast into outer darkness, cast into the lake of fire, they're not cast there as prison guards. They're not cast there as torturers. That is their consequence too. Okay. And so it is the way the Bible conveys it. It is the worst thing that could happen for a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's contrast it with what is the best thing that can happen. Well, what are we made for? We're made to be in fellowship with God. Okay, so the Bible describes God as light. Hell is described as outer darkness. The Bible describes God as the source of calm and peace. God will wipe away all tears. How does hell describe? Wailing and gnashing of teeth, sorrow, despair, just all of this, just this immense sense of loss, this immense sense of missing. Okay. Hell is where God isn't.
Yeah.
Hell is where this is what God is what gives us meaning. Hell is where God in the final analysis looks at someone who chose not to follow him and says, okay, I gave you a choice. I reached out to you. I begged you. I begged with you. I pleaded with you. I sent you my son. And you didn't want to come, so you can have what you want. You can be outside of my presence.
Yeah. A couple things you're making me think about here. One preacher tells the story of some people asking him, I've heard these fire and brimstone sermons. I've heard about, the fire and the torture of hell. Is that true? Is that the way that it really is? And the preacher responded with, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that no, it's probably not like all of those things that you've heard before. Probably the person wiped their brow like, ooh, good. But the bad news is it's worse than that. When Scripture uses the dramatic, the colorful language of hell, of fire, and the eternal torment where the worm is not consumed, and using that language, it is describing what we would think of as the worst thing on this earth to burn for eternity. But in a cosmic sense and a spiritual sense, there is something worse than that, to not be in the presence of God, to know, and also to me that there also has to be some level of knowledge, to continue to be a person, to continue to exist at your soul knows where it's not. Likewise, to be in heaven is to have your knowledge, if that same idea still holds in heaven, but to have your knowledge of God expanded. It's no longer looking through a glass dimly. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. But so once you see, that the need for that blessing is no longer needed. So there's this contrast between the reality of this earth, what we're trying to picture, but the super reality. It is more, heaven and hell are more real than the bliss or the torture that we could experience here on this earth. So we use those words, bliss, torture, but the reality is at a heightened level. All right, Jeremy, do you have more to talk about on the reality of what's going on there?
Well, the concept of torture it's very big in the way the world conceives hell. We think of torture as kind of the Middle Ages type of torture. The Salem witch trial, piling the rocks on people, more weight, things like that. It's more the pain, like you said, of knowing you see God and knowing that you made the wrong choice, right? And just that pain of, I made the wrong choice, and now here are the consequences of of that choice. It's not that, and knowing the torture of knowing it was your choice. The C.S. Lewis quote, "The gates of hell are locked from the inside," right? That idea of, and that's, let's not remove that. See, the question is, how can a loving God torture people in hell? Let's remember, God would have that all men are saved. It's men who make the choice not to follow God. So in many ways, it's the choice of man who doesn't follow God, who doesn't choose God, that leads into this eternal outer darkness.
Yeah. So let's, if you don't mind, Jeremy, let's start. Try what we're going to do. We're going to try to put forward the best argument that someone who has doubts at a minimum, or just doesn't believe in some of the traditional doctrines of hell. Let's put forward some of those. We'll do our best to represent those accurately, because if we don't represent them accurately, we're not doing them the justice that they deserve, and not preparing our own minds to have conversation with those people, try to convince them otherwise. Anyway, but after we present them to the best of our ability, we'll try to present what we believe is the Christian answer to those. So the first one arises out of the idea of choice, so that people are choosing this as the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Anyone in hell is choosing to not follow God if you're in hell, or choosing to humble themselves to live their lives in submission to God, and that is what allows us to enter into heaven. So one of the ideas that is against the idea of hell is basically saying that no human being, if they were informed, if they truly knew what the stakes were, if they actually knew what the choice that they were making. So, for example, I've made choices before, and I'm trying to think of a good example here. This is kind of silly. Okay, so I just bought bananas earlier today, and I'll be honest, I don't really know bananas that well, and so I might bring them home, and Sarah will tell me, "Don't you know those bananas are overripe?" And if only I would have known, I would have made the right choice as far as making bananas goes. Now let's escalate the stakes. It's not choosing bananas; it's choosing eternity. And so some would argue that the idea of hell doesn't make sense, because no human being, properly informed, would ever choose to live eternally excommunicated from God. So how do we justify, how do we as Christians think about the eternal nature of this choice that humans are making?
Well, we have to think of it from the perspective of God, and kind of where God is looking at this. And that's hard. That's really hard for us to do, because we're not God. Okay. And so let's not make any mistake about it. There is an element of looking at God and saying, I don't fully understand, but I trust, because I can begin to conceive kind of where we're coming from here. Okay. So from God's perspective, he made us to be like him. Okay. And when we turn away from him, we are violating the very image of God. We are made in his image. Okay. And we're violating that when we turn from him. Okay. So God comes down and he says, okay, look, I'm going to send prophets. I'm going to have them testify about me. I am going to send my son. And not only am I going to send my son, he is going to do incredible signs, undeniable signs. Okay. How many times in the Gospels do the Pharisees say, we cannot deny a great miracle took place here, right? And not only am I going to do that, but through my providence, I am going to make sure that it is in the best preserved classical documents that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I am going to make sure that those are passed down faithfully. So you have what they wrote. The testimony and is going to be almost, if you throw out this testimony, I'm going to set it up so that the evidence for this testimony is so strong. If you throw it out, you might as well throw out all of what you know of history. Okay. And that's what I'm going to do. And that's the evidence that God leads for us and God leaves for us. And in the face of that, and we say, well, some people, no human being would turn their back on God if they knew the stakes. And yet God lays out the stakes, and there are human beings that turn their back on him.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, if I can, you were alluding to something, and anyone who's in our conversation right now, feel free to open up your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 16. It's a parable, well. It is a parable, but it teaches some interesting things here. The story of the rich man and Lazarus, and I'm not going to go through all of the story, but I want us to jump down to verse 27. So Luke chapter 16, verse 27. So this is Lazarus speaking to Abraham, this cosmic debate that is going on. And he said, and the rich man said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him, Lazarus, to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." Verse 29, "But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." So Jesus is telling this story, and the rich man who is in hell, even as he is feeling the torment of being separated from God, even then, the rich man refuses to acknowledge that he's at fault. And what he's saying in verse 28 is, well, send Lazarus. If they would have known what I know, then they would have not done the things that I did. Basically, the rich man saying, I'm not responsible for my sins because I didn't have complete knowledge. I didn't see a dead man get out of the ground. Irony or foreshadowing, Jesus is going to rise from the dead later on in the book, right? So Jesus is telling the story about, when you are separated from God, your heart, your conscience is so separated from God that you can't be honest with yourself. You can't honestly say that I didn't have free will. And so when the argument is made that no human being would possibly choose to be separated from God for eternity, that same logic could be used that no human being would ever choose to sin at all, like even the smallest sin, if I knew the choices. But we all know, I think it seems obvious that humans have free will, that we choose to do wrong things because sometimes we worship ourselves. I put myself as the chief of sinners here, in that sometimes I make bad choices that deserve to have the justice of God come down on me, and I'm thankful for the grace that we receive. So, we as Christians know these things, but God tells us in Scripture that all people are responsible for their actions. Now, hopefully, we as Christians can show them the way to be saved from those actions, and there's always more that we can do to share that message. But as we're seeing in this parable, the rich man knew, or Abraham's telling him, you knew, you had Moses and the prophets, just like your brothers do. And for that, they are responsible. So I think this idea that no one would ever choose just goes against the idea that even we as Christians know that we've chosen not to follow God. And it's not because of our sinful choices. We are able to be sinful because of our free will. Anyway, thoughts there, Jeremy? We want to go on to the next one.
I think just hitting on this idea of choice. What do we mean by this concept of choice? We are making that choice, and the implication of there being a choice says that there will be people who choose wrongly. There will be people who, to borrow a phrase from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, choose poorly. Okay. And you've seen that movie, there are consequences to that poor choice. Okay. We choose poorly sometimes. So the implication of that is there will be people that make the wrong choice. Mm-hmm. If there aren't, is there really a choice to begin with?
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. If we believe that we are not robots, that we are actually capable of forming a relationship with God, the opposite has to also be true, that we're capable of not having a relationship with Him. Otherwise, the relationship is meaningless, mm-hmm. and that takes the air out of the human experience. So let's put up the next one. Okay, so I'm going to present a math problem, but before people pause and leave the video, it's not a hard math problem. It's the easiest math problem. So the side against hell is going to present to you the easiest math problem you'll ever have. So first of all, imagine on one side of a ledger. So this is, the cosmic spiritual courtroom. And imagine on one side of the ledger, you have the worst sinner ever. But this worst sinner ever has some set number of sins that they did in their life. Whoever it is in your life that you can think of as the worst sinner, they did some number of sins. Let's just pretend and make up a number, 1 billion sins. Okay. On the other side, so that's the crime. On the other side is the punishment. And the punishment of hell is an eternal punishment. Or if we were going to represent that mathematically, it would be that 8 on its side, the infinity sign. And here's the math problem. Which one's bigger? Well, infinity is greater than 1 billion. And so the person who is arguing against the traditional idea of hell would say that any punishment that is eternal always outweighs the crime that was committed. So there's no sense of justice. There can't be a just God who would give a punishment that far outweighs the crime that was done. So, Jeremy, what say you? This math problem seems to go heavily in favor of this cosmic argument.
Well, how many sins does it take to separate you from God?
One.
Yeah. 1. In God's classroom.
That's even more unjust. Infinity is a whole lot bigger than 1.
Not when you're God. I'm gonna swipe part of an illustration from my dad. Okay. In God's classroom, passing grade is 100. The one single point off. You can get a 90, you can get 100 on everything, you get a 99 on one test. That's it, you fail. 1 sin. Because, see, again, this billion to infinity, which for someone to sin 1 billion times in the average human lifetime is, wow, that is impressive. This billion to infinity, that's not the way God looks at it. That's the way we look at it. And, we even, in our statue of justice, she's holding, she's blindfolded, she's got a sword, and she's got the scales. Okay. In the American conception of the justice system, we say no cruel and unusual punishment, and the punishment has to fit the crime. You can't lock somebody up 20 years for going 5 over the speed limit. And we have to remember that those are all human conceptions of justice. Let's go to an eternal perspective, or at least do our best to go to an eternal perspective. We are made in the image of God, the eternal creator of the universe. And when we depart from that, that is an affront to the image of God. Okay. The question before us is, how can a loving God, quote unquote, torture people in hell? I would flip the question. How can a loving God not respond justly to sin? Would a God who just kind of hand-waved away sin, oh, don't worry about it, no big deal, would that God be worthy of worship? In Exodus 34, 6 and 7, God is talking to Moses. He said, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on their children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. In that passage, we not only see the mercy of God, but the justice of God as well. Mm-hmm. Okay. So from an eternal perspective, we are made to be like God, and we turn our back on that. Okay. And the Bible teaches us that God cannot be in the presence of sin. That is how serious sin is. See, we rank violations of justice, and we have misdemeanors and felonies, and then we divide misdemeanors and felonies up, boom, 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 and all these things. Okay. That is not the divine perspective. The divine perspective is one sin irrevocably separates us from our Creator. Period. Okay. And so from God's perspective, we have made our choice to not be like him. And now, and again, don't think of it as we're being locked up. Don't think of it as we're being sent down to the eternal torture chamber. We've made our choice to separate ourselves from him. And so for eternity, we are separated from him. And he's giving us what our choice naturally leads to.
Right, Jeremy, I'll just quickly echo some of the points you're making there. At the same time, we talk about a just God, a God worthy of worship cannot abide by sin. A God that just flippantly says, "Oh, don't worry about it." That's not a just that's not a holy God. At the same, and on the flip side, for human choice, how can God force us to be in his presence? Just as much as God can't force someone with one sin. At the same time, a person with 1 billion sins, whatever that high number is, that person has the same ability to be in God's presence, to put him on. And so you're right, Jeremy. As we think about numbers, God doesn't think about numbers. He thinks about marriage. He thinks about sides. He says, "Are you with me or are you against me? Are you in me or are you outside of me?" So there seems to be a different way of thinking about the issue. Yes, eternal punishment is the worst. It is automatically the worst thing that could possibly happen. Those are the stakes. Those are the stakes of not being in God, of not being willing or wanting to be in his presence. And that is, to me, that's the image of the prodigal father who is waiting for the son to come home and is being prodigal in lavishly giving out gifts to any son that will return, whether the son went to a far off country and committed 1 billion sins or the son stayed home and committed one. All sons are welcome to come home. All right. I think we're good there. And we don't have too much time left. Let's talk about one more generally, and then we'll do closing comments. Sound good to you, Jeremy? Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of put two together. So in the New Testament, we often bring in different images into our ideas of hell, Gehenna, Hades. And so some skeptics will say, so these are Christian skeptics, but they'll say that those two images are not hell. And so how do we understand those images being folded into hell? And in the same breath, I'll also bring up that when we read the Old Testament, there doesn't seem to be a Jewish idea of hell. So some people would argue that hell is something that Christians after the Bible came about, that it's a post first century invention, or at least it's been inflated in some way afterwards, because it certainly didn't come from the Old Testament. We've talked about this in the past: Old Testament God versus New Testament God. So Jeremy, you're the historian here. What do we know about this?
Well,
I didn't prepare Jeremy for this question at all. So
a couple of thoughts just off the top of my head, actually. on this one. The idea that okay, we've already talked about some of our conception of hell does come from outside of the New Testament. Okay,
Right.
The eternal torture chamber that comes from outside.
We can't get past that some of the way that we think about it has been developed in the 2,000 years of Christian history.
Exactly. But the New Testament sure does talk about eternal darkness. And it sure does talk about wailing and gnashing of teeth and the place where the worms never die. It talks about a lake of fire. And what you really want to throw a monkey wrench in somebody's mental gears. Okay, point this little tidbit out at them. Which person, not character, person in the Bible talks the most about hell? It's Jesus. You know, the guy that's all about love and, you know, all that. You know, you got somebody who they buy into the hippie Jesus version. Okay, point that out and just watch the gears smoke on that one. See, so clearly there is an eternal consequence. And I hope you've noticed I've avoided the use of the word punishment. There's an eternal consequence to the choice. Okay. And why is Jesus the person that talks more about hell than any other person in the Bible? Well, who is the final revelation? The final revelation from God is about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He knows. Okay, it's kind of like you're getting to the end of the semester and your teacher says, okay, if you haven't done any work yet, you really need to start, okay? Because an A is probably out of reach, but you might be able to get to a 70, okay? Jesus is saying, look, the final choice, it's now, okay? There's not going to be another revelation. There's not going to be another opportunity. This is it, okay? So there is clearly in the New Testament a finality to this. And there is clearly a judgment. It is appointed unto man once to die and then to face the judgment. And there is clearly an outer darkness. Okay. And again, God is depicted as light. Hell is depicted as outer darkness. Hell is the place where God isn't. There is clearly a place in eternity that God isn't, where God will say, for the final time, I will not force you. You have made your choice. Go. Okay. Hell is where God gives the person who doesn't want to be in fellowship with God what they want. He finally stops calling them and says, okay, go ahead. And that is straight out of the New Testament, straight out of the Gospels. It's Jesus that talks about this. Okay. And remember, Jesus completes the revelation of the Old Testament. So, you know, if there's a place, a house, a mansion with many rooms that we are going, okay, that is something Jesus talks about that you will not find in the Old Testament either. So, if we're going to sit down on this idea that, well, there's no hell in the Old Testament, there's no heaven in the Christian conception either. There's a throne room of God. But generally, the Old Testament just talks about Sheol and death and all that. So Jesus talks a lot about heaven too. Talks about the mansion he's preparing for us, and Abraham's bosom and all of that. Okay. So Jesus completes that revelation. It makes sense that he would say, "Okay, I'm going to deepen your understanding of what's coming, and here it is."
Yeah, very well said. Just a quick thing before we go to final comments. I will say that, and this is something we've talked about from the beginning of this particular conversation. When we read Scripture, we're often reading representations. You know, Gehenna was something that the first century Jews or the people surrounding Jesus would have known exactly what that was. So using these concrete examples is not a bug of the theology of hell. It's actually a feature to make it real for those people and for those of us who are now were able to know what Gehenna was because of that. And it doesn't subtract from the reality of what is meant by the representation that Jesus is putting forward. And as Jeremy is saying, there's plenty of evidence to build from all of the statements that it is pointing towards this reality that we have to choose from in the end. So maybe just a couple more minutes. Jeremy, we've spent a little over 30 minutes here talking about hell, the reality of it. What's the takeaway that we as Christians need to have as we're thinking about the conversations we will have with people about this and what it means for our own practical theology and living the Christian life?
I think a lot of the problem with the way the world conceives of hell comes from Christians. The way we talk sometimes, God is sitting up in heaven and he's got his notebook and he's got his eternal pen and he's writing down everything you do and he just can't wait. And all right, here we go. And purposeful or not, we leave that impression sometimes. Stop doing that. Because some of this question comes from, okay, why would a loving God want to send people to hell? He doesn't. He doesn't want to send people to hell. He wants us to be saved, but he won't step on our choice. And when you conceive, again, of this idea of the justice of God, what surprises me is not that there are consequences to sin. What surprises me is that Jesus paid those consequences for us. How serious is hell? God sent his son to try to give people a way out. See, what is stunning is not the consequence of sin, it's grace. Hell is so serious, and God is so serious about not wanting us to go there that he sent Jesus, and he made a way through grace for us to come back. God is a just God. He's also a merciful God.
Well said. I cede my time to what Jeremy said. So I think that's a really good place to end. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for joining in on this conversation. We hope that it has sparked some thoughts about how we think about hell and also how we present the loving grace of God to our family, friends, coworkers, whoever it is that we meet, to let them know that God has prepared a place for us. So thanks for being a part of our conversation, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.